This is a conversation with Justin Bronk. Justin is a senior research fellow for Airpower and Technology at the Royal United Services Institute, a professor at the Royal Norwegian Air Force Academy, an active private pilot, and one of the most respected experts on air power and technology in the world. In this interview, we talk about a lot of different things. We discussed the F-35s and its criticism, and how it compares to its Russian and Chinese counterparts. How did Ukraine change what role air power plays in conflict? What kind of impact are the F-16s having on the war, or whether the Ukrainian Air Force will start operating other Western-made planes, and much more. It's a great conversation, and I really hope you'll enjoy it. And now, enjoy the conversation.
So, welcome to the podcast.
Hi there. Thanks for having me.
So, I was thinking about where it would be the best to start this, because I want to talk about a lot of different things, a lot of different topics. And in the end, I was kind of helped out by Elon Musk, because I think last week he's sort of joined publicly the conversation about the F-35s, the US fifth generation fighter that the US spent enormous amounts of money on developing, and which is basically the pinnacle of the most high-tech plane technology of today. And Elon Musk said on Twitter that, to quote, the F-35 design was broken at the requirements level because it was required by too many things to too many people, and that manned fighter jets are obsolete in the age of drones anyway, will just get pilots killed. So I was wondering, maybe a good way to start would be to get your thoughts on that. Do you think that there's any truth in this?
I mean, there are elements of truth that he is sort of clearly drawing on in forming his opinions. So, for example, he mentions that the plane aircraft, in this case the F-35, was required to do too many things by too many people. Well, certainly the aircraft has some design compromises from the fact that short takeoff and vertical landing was required by the Marine Corps version, the Bravo, which the UK also operates, but that they wanted design commonality as far as possible with the conventional takeoff and the carrier, that takeoff and landing version, the C as well. And that did push choices in terms of the shape of the aircraft and some of the internal layout that you might not want to do if you were just going for a conventional land-based aircraft, for example. So, you can see in that example where there are some choices that were made 20 years ago plus at this stage, which he's clearly read about at some point or heard about and is referencing. And there are also increasing amounts of possibility offered by high-end uncrewed systems. So the US Air Force would call them advanced autonomous combat platforms, or ACPs. Sorry, that's the Royal Air Force would call them ACPs, autonomous collaborative platforms. The US Air Force would call them CCAs, so collaborative combat aircraft. Essentially, these are things that start off potentially relatively small and end up as big as you want, looking to do different classes of supplementary capability alongside fighter aircraft or other combat aircraft with uncrewed systems to hopefully do things a bit more cheaply. But none of those are anywhere close to being able to replace the totality of what a piloted aircraft gives you, particularly a very advanced one like the F-35. And so, yeah, you, for someone who works in the industry, has done for a while, you can see kind of threads of where Musk's statement is kind of drawing on things that have some basis in reality. But for example, in that particular tweet thread that he kicked that F-35 intervention off with, it started with a couple of images of a very large, essentially drone swarm display by a Chinese organization. And that was his sort of starting point to say, when you look at these things, I think his words were, anyone still investing in piloted fighter aircraft is an idiot. Words to that effect. And the problem with that sort of approach is that anything small and cheap enough to mass in those quantities, so even with all the clever AI-enabled or swarming things you might want to do, anything that is cheap enough will be so small that it by definition can't go very far. And so where I think there probably has been a very significant change in the way that warfare will need to be fought, or at least what forces will need to be prepared to do, from massed small UAVs, is actually not in the air domain with traditional fighter aircraft like the F-35, but it's actually in the land domain where you're seeing where those ranges are much shorter. So, between different frontline areas, for example, yes, those small UAVs can be massed in huge numbers, as we see in Ukraine. But if you're looking at, for example, the US military's requirements for the F-35, which, one of the major criticisms of it within the US military is that it doesn't necessarily have the range that they need in the Indo-Pacific. Well, an F-35A will push about 600 nautical mile combat radius, unrefueled. And so that's assuming you're not doing air-to-air refueling. A small quadcopter with the most efficient batteries you're currently looking at that might be $2,000 or $3,000 with a small warhead and sensor feed or whatever, would be lucky to push 10 kilometers. So, and that's one way, not necessarily not coming back. So I think what Musk's position on fighter aircraft being sort of non-viable because of what uncrewed systems are allowing you to do these days. Firstly, perhaps skipped over the importance of range, distance, payload, cost. If you want an uncrewed system to do the sorts of things that you currently use fighter aircraft like the F-35 to do over the ranges that you require them to do it at, particularly the US and the Indo-Pacific, more so than, say, European countries, then you could do some of those things with an uncrewed system, but that uncrewed system will have to go hundreds of miles. And it probably, most of them can't air-to-air refuel. If you want it to be able to air-to-air refuel, then you're still dependent on a big tanker, and also your complexity just went up hugely for what you need in that system from the sensor and control laws point of view. You pretty rapidly end up with uncrewed systems that are about the same size as fighter aircraft. They might be different shapes, but about the same size, which can be a bit more efficient because you don't have to have a cockpit in there, and therefore you can use more internal space for fuel and all that sort of thing. But you trade off additional software and sensor complexity because you need it to be able to see and do more stuff without the benefit of a human being able to be that interpretive layer and also having eyes and a head and an ability to look around. And the human eye in particular is very good at foveating. So focusing attention on very, very specific bits of a field of view with incredibly short frame times. Essentially, if you imagine in a fighter pilot context, if you go into a visual fight of something going past you, which actually happens quite often, even though the majority of state-on-state conflict assumes the majority of long-range, a lot of engagements would be long-range, beyond visual range, with missiles. Particularly as you move to a stealth aircraft on both sides, people are detecting each other later as they come towards each other, so often you are getting mergers. So when aircraft come into visual range, increasingly in, for example, major exercises as 5th gen starts, so F-35 starts being used by red adversary players as well as blue. So you might get into visual range. But also if you're air policing on a disputed border, for example, next to each other before something kicks off, you sort of start in visual range almost by definition. So if you imagine that, for example, of two aircraft going past one another, as they flash past, the human eye and brain will focus as you turn your head to watch it go past, will focus subconsciously on things like control deflection. So even if you don't see him start to turn as he goes past you left or right or pull up or maybe flip to go down, even if you don't quite see that, you might well subconsciously pick up control deflections, which with enough experience, an experienced fighter pilot will be able to essentially know, okay, so they're going left or they're going right or they're going up, and therefore start their own turn to respond to that. So depending on whatever they think their comparative advantages and disadvantages are, they will then respond accordingly. For an AI-powered aircraft to do that, so I'd be fascinated to know, for example, what the recent F-16 that they adapted and Frank Kendall went up in that can dogfight, I'd be fascinated to know what its inputs are, because as far as I'm aware, cameras don't yet exist that can do that 3D tracking with the sufficiently high visual or pixel clarity to get that level of indicator from something which for a machine would be an incredibly tiny part of the overall image. But a human will naturally kind of focus on where they need to focus and even just do the processing subconsciously. Because, of course, for a traditional fighter like an F-16, if the AI is only using the sensors on the jet, then it only really has view forward. And so once you go past each other, the AI will then essentially be blind, unless it has a data link to another source of information, which I suspect they probably did in those tests, to tell them where the opponent is when the opponent is outside of the sensor cone. And so that if you were to do a 3D camera that had that kind of resolution, you would have huge bandwidth requirements for it and very specific programming, and you needed, in an aperture system like the EOTS system on the F-35, which is a 360-degree electro-optical system. But as far as I'm aware, does not give you that level of high-definition fidelity up close. It's brilliant at detecting and tracking objects far away and heat signatures far away, and much better than the human eye. But I guess what I'm getting at is, even in the relatively simple scenario of a dogfight, which is generally where uncrewed systems are, particularly AI-enabled pilot programs are currently tested, is in what's called basic fighter maneuvers, BFMs, dogfights. One-on-one, which is about as simple as it gets. Yes, you can get to a point where the AI is consistently beating human pilots by training against itself and other pilots. But there's actually a huge amount of real-world complexity involved and difficulty involved in making that reliable and practical in the real world in all circumstances before you ever get close to scaling up to much larger and more complex mission sets, where there's all sorts of inputs that and tasks that a pilot is doing, most of which are not actually combat inputs. They are dealing with unexpected stuff, dealing with human air traffic control, dealing with civilian traffic, parsing rule of engagement changes, doing mission planning, air-to-air refueling, comms within not just their own squadrons' aircraft, other squadrons that are contributing assets to the composite air operation, including probably some assets from other countries that, if you have an AI now, it needs to be able to adapt to work with not just your own Air Force's ecosystem, but actually other air forces that you're allied with. And, basic stuff like if you're in the pattern on an airfield, how do you deal with somebody doing the wrong thing in the pattern and somebody landing on the wrong runway or somebody turning off onto your taxiway as all of these things are things that human beings don't necessarily think a huge amount about, because we are very good at unexpected contextual adaptation, even though we're not nearly as good at crunching huge amounts of data. But for something to replace what you do with fast jets in its entirety, you have to be able to handle all of those things. And therefore, the programming complexity and the dataset complexity and the sensor complexity that you need to build into an uncrewed system is actually enormous. And so what you very quickly end up with is something about the size of a fighter aircraft that is actually significantly less flexible, even though it might be better at the cutting edge, that still costs a few tens of millions of dollars. And you certainly can't mass by the thousands in some sort of swarm because of the costs. It's a very long-winded answer, but essentially, no, Elon is not correct. What's a shame is that there's a lot of nuance within the stuff that he's clearly pulling on to inform his view that's really interesting, really important, and where radical thinking can deliver significant improvements. But the secret sauce, as it were, in all the different countries that are experimenting, and they are experimenting with these uncrewed systems for using as traditional air power stand-ins. The secret sauce is that they're not a replacement for the crewed systems. They are an augmentation for the crewed systems and for your traditional standoff weapons. A lot of your weapons as well are already actually lethal, autonomous, uncrewed long-range systems. So like a cruise missile, in a modern cruise missile, actually has a huge amount of lethal autonomy capability baked into it to detect, prioritize, and choose targets and attack them automatically or autonomously. They can communicate with other weapons in a swarm in some cases. You've already got things like the miniature air launch decoy X, so Mold X, which does some really interesting jamming and spoofing and can do some other stuff, but can loiter for hours inside enemy territory. It looks like a cruise missile, but it's actually, if you developed it from a drone company, people would say that is a very advanced, stealthy, uncrewed jet drone system. But it's actually, because it's been developed from a line of systems, the Air Launch Decoy 160, ADM 160 series, it's just seen as a weapon. There's a huge amount of benefit here, but it's fulfilling niche roles to augment the crewed systems that you can't have enough of because of the cost and pilot training and all of that stuff.
If you're enjoying this podcast, chances are that you like to know what's going on in the world of geopolitics. And if that's the case, you might want to sign up to my newsletter. It's launching from January, it's completely free, and you can already sign up so that you receive the first edition. You can find the link in the description, so check it out and sign up to stay informed. And now, back to the conversation.
And I guess the only other thing to ask when you look at this stuff, even if one doesn't want to go into all the technical side of things, is, okay, why are the Chinese still building hundreds of fighter jets and developing a next generation piloted fighter jet? Why are the Russians still building fighter jets? Why is every European country that currently makes fighter jets looking at building a new fighter jet, as well as buying more? And why has almost every country that has been allowed to look at it behind the black curtain, so to speak, so been allowed to look into some of the more classified capabilities and compare them to other aircraft on the market, why have almost every single one that's been allowed to look gone for the F-35? Because not just political alignment with America. In some cases, that was the key thing, but in a lot of cases, and I've seen some of the metrics on some of those competitions, yeah, there's a very, very good reason why countries that require an ability to operate in contested airspace, if they have the option, almost exclusively buy the F-35 and have done for 10 years. It's not the most efficient aircraft for a whole host of other things. So if you don't require the ability to penetrate into defended airspace and do things, particularly going after ground-based air defense systems, then actually, if you just want to do air defense, for example, across relatively short ranges and then maybe a little bit of air policing, then the F-35 is actually quite an inefficient thing to choose. You would be much better off buying something much cheaper to operate and to purchase, that's simpler, easier to maintain, has wider weapon options potentially, although actually F-35, if you go external, has quite a lot of weapon options as well. You know, something like the Saab Gripen or, you know, Eurofighter or a modernized F-16 or Rafale or whatever. All of which have their own different skews and balances towards different capabilities. But yeah, if you want to go into other people's defended airspace at range, F-35 is still the best capability out there. And every single country that has had the option to buy it, that has those requirements, has bought the F-35 over other stuff. So it would be surprising if Elon had, before he's allowed access to any of the high classification data on it, come to a much better outcome analytically than all of those countries and the DoD for all of these competitions. Despite the fact that he's right, there are lots and lots of flaws in the F-35 program and base design spec.
So you've hinted at a lot of different, about 7 or 8 different questions that I wanted to talk about in more detail. So I'd like to kind of unpack each one of them separately. But before maybe to step away, to stick to F-35, but step away from Elon Musk, there does seem to be a lot of criticism. And from someone who doesn't work in the industry, who's not an expert, it's quite hard to sort of differentiate between how much of that criticism is actually legitimate. So why does F-35 specifically, and given the fact that it seems to be probably the best option on the market for a lot of potential buyers and for a lot of different use cases, why does it still seem to attract a lot more criticism than fighter jets or military planes normally tend to get, in my lay opinion? And how much of that criticism is actually legitimate?
So, I mean, there's a few reasons why it attracts a lot of criticism. You know, first and foremost, it's the most expensive weapon system ever made. And if you look at the overall program, although it is by no means the most expensive individual weapon system, a B-2, for example, a stealth bomber, that's at about $2.3 billion each, compared to roughly $80 million for a base airframe of an F-35A and about $120 million for a full up, engine, software support, all of that included a 5A. Nowhere close. But because of the cost of the program and the fact that there were huge problems throughout its development, particularly with software complexity, and the fact that, as we mentioned before, that there were probably far too many different service requirements for different versions that ended up really complicating things. And there was also a decision to do something called concurrency, where they started building jets before they had completed some of the later kind of essentially bug fixing and development, which then meant that not only did they have multiple versions to deal with, but they actually also then had to retrofit a bunch of the early jets, and are still having to do that, for example, with what's called Technology Refresh 3, so TR3, which is the upgraded hardware to enable you to run some of the more advanced capabilities within the software blocks that used to be called Block 4 and are now actually split out into other things. And the result is the aircraft is significantly later than its original design promises, and continues to require costly and time-consuming retrofits and upgrades to chase the original very lofty performance promises and goals, which are basically, when they were set, were beyond what technology could deliver. But they were set and promised in order to lock in commitments to the program from both US services and allies. And so, there are a huge number of things where if you look back at the F-35 program, if you could go back and start again, you would do a lot of things differently. And so for people who look closely at program management in a defense industrial context, they often really dislike the program because there's a load of things that they look at and like, these are examples of what not to do. There's also a very, very strong, there's a body of people in the defense industrial space in other countries who make other jets, and also in the US to a degree for example, in manufacturers like Boeing who make other competing jets or used to compete. And there's a strong dislike of the F-35 because of what it represents, which is essentially a very, very dominant competitor in the export space over multiple decades, and one behind which the US government has at times put a huge amount of political clout as well. And so, if you work in Dassault or BAE Systems or Airbus Defence and Space or Leonardo or Saab or Boeing, especially if you work in the overseas campaigns, so the export sort of competition bits of those business, the F-35 has been a problem that has kind of defined a lot of the challenges. It's not that nobody ever wins any other fighter exports, they absolutely do. But as I've said, where the F-35 is offered, because a lot of those exports for Typhoon, Rafale, Gripen, F-18, F-16, where they win competitions, it's generally where the country in question is not being offered the F-35, or incredibly obviously can't afford it. So, for people who are trying to maintain their defense industry in the air sector, who don't work at Lockheed Martin or one of the subsidiaries that contribute to F-35, which of course BAE Systems, for example, contributes to F-35 as well as to Typhoon, and soon to be Global Combat Aircraft Program. So it's all interlinked. But basically, there's a body of people for whom the F-35 has been the main opponent, essentially, throughout their defense industrial career. And therefore, they will take any opportunity to highlight its deficiencies or bad news for the program because it helps with them. And of course, US fighter manufacturers, including Lockheed, would, some people in their export campaigns, but sometimes I'm sure do similar things the other way because it's a competitive space. And these are companies, countries, and individuals competing for contracts worth billions and billions over multiple decades. And there's also just an element of it is because of the cost and the huge problems early on in the program. There are massive oversight and accountability mechanisms that the US government has put in place for F-35, which means that there is a degree of granularity of public information on the F-35's delays, issues, cost overruns, and the progress made to fix them. There is a degree of public visibility on that is not matched in any other fighter program, not even close. So, it is probably also fair to highlight that most other fighter programs are also late and over budget, and some of the things they said would happen didn't happen yet because the funding didn't line up and, the delays of whatever kind. And there's plenty of examples you could point to in a lot of jets where things that were promised would be on the jet by now, 10 years ago, 5 years ago, are not on the jet, and very expensive to get there. But those programs don't have the Joint Program Office, the NAO oversight, the regular reporting requirements through Congress that F-35 does. And so you see a lot more of the F-35's programmatic issues than you do on other jets. What you don't see is the operational benefit side of it. So, I've been lucky enough to fly with fourth generation jets, flying both alongside and then against F-35s as part of a wider exercise. Flying with it, from a different country as well, so it's not perfect integration in this particular example that I saw. But flying with it, you get utterly superb situational awareness and support. And anytime that something is engaging you, generally speaking, you will be warned by various mechanisms, by the F-35 pilots or by the F-35s themselves. And so you are much more aware than your own sensors would enable you to be in a fourth generation jet if there's an F-35 operating in the package with you of any threats. So you can adapt to them and respond to them much, much earlier. They can provide electronic warfare support, so degrading enemy radar performance at critical moments to, again, defend both themselves and potentially defend other fourth generation assets that are in the same package. Relatively short range, and it depends. There's a whole host of dependencies on that, but it's very impressive when you see it done. And the same goes the other way for fighting against them. You might get ghost echoes sometimes, depending on the system that you're operating. We couldn't see anything, but in terms of where the F-35s themselves were. But even if you can get rough indications, we knew they were in the area anyway. As a radar, operating a radar, when there are other things that you can see, you can't just ignore the things that you can see because you know that there are stealth aircraft there that you might be able to get a ghost echo on once in a while. So you're left with either trying to focus on finding the things that are really hard to see, in which case you don't have nearly the capacity you need to deal with the things you can, or you focus on the things you can see, and the things you can't see, i.e. F-35s kill you. And even when you do get weapon solutions on, as playing the enemy in this case, on some of the fourth gen things that we could see, you start being on the receiving end of those F-35 electronic warfare capabilities, as well as, of course, their missiles. And, they're not invincible. They can be shot down, as anything can. B-2 can be shot down in exercises in specific circumstances. The level of capability that it brings operationally is just in a different class to traditional fast air. And what's more, the F-35 capability set complements existing fighters, so the traditional non-stealth fighter sets, so well, because where the F-35 has limitations, which are chiefly it's relatively difficult and expensive to maintain because it's complicated, and the global supply chain was, the production of new aircraft has been prioritized for a long time industrially over production of spare parts. So what you have is global shortages of spare parts, and so for a given fleet size, you will typically see less F-5s actually flyable in any given moment for a given amount of money and people that you put in, which again leads to criticism, rightly. It's funnily enough actually really quite cheap to buy now compared to most other jets. So the economies of scale have got to a point where actually the F-35 is actually cheaper to acquire in most cases now than competing non-stealth jets. But it's much more expensive to run and to maintain. So, there are limitations there, which mean that generally speaking, you won't see as many F-35s in the air as other things. And if they're trying to be stealthy, which, is kind of their thing, then they're carrying all their weapons and fuel internal. And so weapon loadout will be significantly lighter than theoretically you might see on a multi-role jet that's non-stealthy. So a Typhoon or a Rafale or whatever can all carry more stuff generally. Although it's notable that generally when you're flying around in exercises, all the multi-role jets aren't carrying much other than fuel tanks anyway. So in exercises, you're also dealing with traditional jets that are not suffering the weight and drag penalties that they would actually be suffering if they were loaded out with standoff missiles or bombs plus fuel tanks plus air-to-air weapons plus a targeting pod. So the comparison is not entirely fair. But basically, that additional weapons load, visibility, ability to broadcast on radar without worrying about giving themselves away because they're already visible, that you get with traditional jets, 15, Typhoon, Rafale, Gripen, complements the stealthiness, the electronic warfare stand-in capabilities, the fantastic situational awareness that even a small number of F-35s can bring to that composite package, and vice versa. They really do complement each other. So, for example, in the Royal Air Force, we find, because we have the F-35B with RAF and the Royal Navy, and also the Typhoon, which is a kind of classic traditional jet. It's kind of magnificent as an aeroplane, but it's not subtle. But they call it the thug and the assassin. So, the thug is something you have to respond to. It's there, it's loud, it's banging away with lots of radar energy and really long-range missiles, and quite a lot of them. And you can have quite a few in the air. And that makes it really difficult to deal with the F-35s, the assassins that are a little bit further forward, that have better situational awareness and can also deliver weapons effects, but also EW. And dealing with the two in combination is much, much harder than dealing with a greater number of either one of them on their own. And so, it's an enormously capable system. And because of classification issues, most of the public debate on F-35 does not include or see why countries keep buying it and why air forces love it. Because actually, what it offers operationally in a high-threat environment just can't be replicated with any other competing system. You can potentially accomplish some of the effects using other jets, but to do so, you would have to use far more jets with far more standoff munitions, with a lower probability of kill, therefore launched in larger numbers with a higher risk appetite, and more air-to-air munitions also launched at longer range. You functionally would, for example, end up using, $30 million of standoff munitions per sortie, per pulse, to accomplish the same weapons effect terminally that you could accomplish with a small number of F-35s, a couple of standoff weapons or stand-in weapons, depending on the threat, and offensive fighter cap. The counter-argument to that on the F-35 side is that what most fast jet fleets spend most of their time doing is not going into high-threat missile engagement zones from Russian or Chinese ground-based air defense systems and high-end fast air. Instead, what most jets spend their time doing is quick reaction alert and territorial defense, and contributing to multinational stabilization or counterinsurgency operations or whatever, traditionally, over the last 20 years. And for those things, you don't need an F-35, really. So you could flip it around and say, well, actually, particularly for nations that struggle with money, as all nations do, but to a greater or lesser extent, so maybe air forces that really struggle with money, you could make the argument that it's better to have the thing that is what we call minimum viable product, the traditional, cheaper to operate jets in larger numbers that can fulfill your day-to-day tasks, and then invest in lots and lots of standoff munitions as a stockpile in case you ever need to go and do the high-end thing, which, yes, will then be much more expensive to do for a given effect than if you had F-35, but you hope you never have to do it. If countries were sitting on huge stockpiles of standoff weapons relevant to that suppression and destruction of air defenses task, then that argument would hold. But countries aren't sitting on huge stockpiles of standoff weapons, so except China.
Just a quick break here to let you know that the corporate sponsor of this podcast is Conductor, which provides software for crisis exercises for everything from cyber threats and supply chain security to hybrid warfare. Thank you, Conductor, for sponsoring this podcast. And now, back to the conversation.
And I guess since we're in a situation when most European countries that are mostly buying the F-35s are preparing now mainly for a situation that would involve missions where you're facing Russian, or in the US case, Chinese competition in air defense, does make a little bit more sense. But it kind of leads me to my next question, talking about Russia and China, because the US and F-35 is not the only fifth generation fighter jet, if I'm correct. And both of these countries are either developing or they already have their own versions. So how do they compare to the F?
So, big caveats up front. We have a limited amount of granular information, at least outside a very high level of classification, because if there was granular information, let's say, on how the actual radar systems perform, not just how they work, but how they perform, or the internal cockpit information flow works for the pilots of, let's say, a Chinese or a Russian Sukhoi 57, the sources of that information would have to be quite pointy. So all that sort of information, even though you might say, well, but this is information that the enemy would know already, and therefore why would you classify it very highly? There's often a thing in military intelligence circles that information like that is classified not necessarily because you don't want the enemy to find out about that information because they already know it. But if the enemy knew that you knew that information, they could work out pretty quickly how you got it. And that would expose capabilities that you don't want to expose. So big caveats up front. There are unknowns, especially in the public domain, about comparative performance. But in big handfuls, the Chinese J-20 is a fairly credible fifth generation type capability. As if what we're saying with fifth generation is that it is like the F-35 or F-22 in the US, is that they combine stealth, fighter class performance, so stealth in the X and a bit of the K and Q bands of the radar spectrum, with internal weapons loads and fantastic situational awareness from multiple sensor sources fused as a single display for the pilot, which can be gathered without giving away their position, which is another absolutely critical requirement that people always forget for stealth aircraft to work. If a stealth aircraft is passively stealthy, i.e. shape and coatings and what have you, but in order to see anything with its radar or other sensors and employ weapons, it has to emit a load of energy in a fairly unsubtle manner. That will give away its position. So it then is stuck with either not really being able to employ or have situational awareness, or giving itself away, in which case it doesn't really work as a fifth generation aircraft. And so that sensor requirement is where a lot of that public uncertainty about comparative capabilities would be. But basically, the Chinese have got to a stage where they are producing it's not as stealthy as the F-35 or the F-22, but the J-20 is optimized around Chinese requirements, not American requirements. So for the Chinese, what the J-20 needs to be able to do is be stealthy enough to blend into and be very difficult to detect, albeit not impossible, and difficult, crucially, to track and engage, which is much harder than detect. In the context of all the noise that would be going on in a clash between Chinese forces and either US allies or the US itself, where you would have hundreds of traditional jets, thousands of missile tracks, potentially conflict in orbit, certainly degradation through non-kinetic, so electronic warfare and dazzling and other things, cyber attacks, of orbital surveillance assets, and just generally absolute chaos going on. In that context, where the ability to link sensors together is more difficult to get multiple views on a thing, and just in general, there'll be a lot more noise. In that context, the J-20 just needs to be stealthy enough to be difficult to detect and track, with a long range to enable it to hunt down the primary targets, which are American tanker aircraft for the most part, and to a degree American AWACS or electronic warfare aircraft as well. Because in the distances of the Indo-Pacific, the Chinese strategy is essentially to have an enormous missile arsenal, so ballistic missiles, as well as cruise missiles, both subsonic and supersonic. So you have a whole host of different capability areas that you have to try and defend against from a missile defense point of view as the US, to the point that with the arsenals they have, it's not really defensible, most US forward bases in the first island chain. So one would have to assume in any direct clash with the Chinese that they would rain literally hundreds of high-end maneuverable ballistic supersonic cruise and subsonic cruise missiles onto those few American big forward bases in Japan, in South Korea, in Okinawa, elsewhere in that first island chain area. And they would also do the same with anti-ship weapons to any US task group that was within multiple hundreds of miles of the Chinese mainland. And so projecting air power into the region to start taking out those Chinese long-range missile launchers, radars, sensor chains, bases, which is what the US would have to do, requires very long flights from the nearest usable base, which might be Guam or even further back. at which point you are incredibly dependent on aerial refueling tankers. And so the Chinese, in addition to developing this huge missile arsenal and sensor chains to take out the bases and the aircraft carriers as far out as they can, have also developed the J-20 specifically to be with long-range missiles, long internal range on fuel, as well as the ability to carry drop tanks and jettison them to get back the stealth, to blend into that noise of any clash and basically hunt US enablers, as I say, aerial refueling tankers in particular. Because if they can push those back past about 1,000 nautical miles from the Chinese mainland, then it doesn't really matter that the F-22 and the F-35 are very, very stealthy, particularly F-22, very stealthy, extremely lethal, fantastic sensor suites, because they just won't be able to get there. Or at least would be getting there in such small numbers and such small pulses that they'd really struggle to deal with the mass of Chinese capabilities. So that's kind of where the J-20 sits, and it's why they haven't, the Chinese, pushed as hard, I think, on really high-end stealth, because I think in their concept they don't think they need it. And it's really difficult. So instead they have a large fighter with a lot of range, big internal weapons bay that can take the PL-15, which is a very long-range air-to-air missile. They have a modern active electronically scanned array AESA radar, like the F-35 or F-22. It's low probability of detection, low probability of intercept capabilities. That's where you get into the unknown outside of a highly classified space. So ability to scan without being detected, you probably can't tell in the public domain. But yeah, it's in the same sort of class as the F-35 and the F-22. I think it's fair to call the J-20A and the J-20B variants that they're continuing to iterate towards. And there will obviously be a J-20C at some point, which will be more capable. 5th generation in the true sense, for functional purposes. And they also have their new J-31 or J-35, depending on what you call it, which is essentially a bastardized F-35 without some of the design compromises for STOVL. That's much earlier in development, and I wouldn't necessarily suggest that currently merits inclusion in a list of operational 5th generation aircraft. It's really quite easy to build something that flies that looks kind of like a 5th generation aircraft. It's unbelievably difficult to go from that stage to a production standard aircraft that works like a 5th generation aircraft, especially given that the sensor technology continues to improve globally. And so the goalposts to what you need to have a given level of passive stealth continue to move as you try and develop. So you've seen things that look a bit like 5th generation fighters flown by South Korea, although that's got external weapons carriage, so it's not really, it's more kind of 4.5, but you've seen it flown by Turkey. Japan flew a demonstrator. There's quite a lot of development programs out there, and the Russians have a few things. Checkmate is the latest kind of paper project that doesn't really exist in terms of a functional fighter program. But when you look at this Sukhoi 57, so the Felon, as we would call it in NATO, so that's their quote-unquote 5th generation aircraft, it really doesn't, I would suggest, merit inclusion in the same category as the F-22, F-35 and J-20. Firstly, because they've made a number of design choices which basically privilege super maneuverability, so post-stall maneuverability, kind of airshow type tricks, which are, to be honest, a pretty dubious use in most actual combat situations, because in order to do them, what you essentially have to do is turn the aircraft into a gigantic air brake, so you lose all airspeed and then have to gain it back. It's great for getting a snapshot at somebody, but fighters don't fly singly, so you better hope that you kill them, because if you don't with that snapshot, then you've got no energy and you're essentially helpless. But also, even if you do kill the person you've snapshotted at, they'll have a wingman who will then kill you. So there's, to be honest, limited utility, I would say, for a lot of those postal maneuvering capabilities, but they're aerodynamically impressive. But the Russians have chosen things, for example, they have these things called levcons, which are leading edge vortex generator control surfaces. So on the front edge of the wing, where you would have normally a sort of a lurks or a leading edge route extension that gives you additional high alpha, so high angle of attack controllability, which the flanker series is, the preceding Sukhoi 27, 30, 35 series is phenomenally capable at. They've actually added movable control surfaces on those leading edges, so levcons, which further enhance the already impressive maneuverability of any flanker derivation, but add control actuators and essentially the kind of gaps, for want of a better term, where those control surfaces meet the rest of the wing, which degrade your radar signature. Even if your manufacturing tolerances are extremely tight and very, very consistent. So the F-35, for example, has leading edge slats, and so there is a gap on those leading edge slats. There is some cost to that, although in terms of signature, but the tolerances and the shaping of those gap meeting points is very, very carefully done. And the Russians just struggle with that level of essentially quality control and industrial tolerances. The Sukhoi 57 production versions that they are producing slowly, there's about 14 to 16 of them currently, they're a significantly better quality than the original T-Fuel Pack FA, as it used to be known, prototypes, which really were very rough, really inconsistent gaps and almost wood screw type rivets. But nevertheless, Russian industry is not really geared up to produce tolerances that fine on a consistent basis. And their understanding of how to do so with minimal radar cross-section impact isn't nearly at the same level as the particularly US industry that has 4 generations of operational stealth combat aircraft now under their belt, or Chinese industry that has just stolen so much tech, but also, to their credit, poured so much money and thousands of PhD level researchers over a decade and a half into that they really have closed the gap very significantly. The Russians just don't have the scale, the money, the focus, the industrial base to be able to do that. And so what you see with the Sukhoi 57 is essentially an aircraft which fixes most of the main drawbacks of the classic flanker. You know, if you look at a flanker, it's got great aerodynamic performance, it's fast, it can fly high, it can do it for a fairly long time, and it's very maneuverable. It carries a big, very unsubtle radar, but, you know, it's the brightest flashlight in the room kind of thing. You can always see it, but it can see stuff pretty well. And a lot of missiles. Whereas the Su-57 essentially fixes the drawbacks of the flanker having a signature in almost every bit of the spectrum that is the size of a large apartment building. So the Su-57 is not stealthy like an F-35 or an F-22 or even a J-20, but it's much, much, much quieter in the radar returns department than a traditional flanker. It is low observable, not very low observable would be the categories. So in that sense, it's a significant improvement. And for anything that is not a true 5th generation fighter, the Su-50 represents a different class of threat to the old the older Su-35. I say old, it's still in production, but especially if it's carrying its weapons internally. And it does finally have an operational active electronically scanned array radar. In fact, it has multiples. It has 2 little ones on the sides to give it beam performance, and a tail sting radar as well, looking backwards. Where we can't tell, but I would be very surprised if the Russians have managed to get it working as intended, given the limitations on their domestic microelectronics industry and avionics industry. You know, if you look in the Sukhoi 35, still in most Sukhoi 35s, which is the most advanced other fighter in Russian service, all the cockpit displays and avionics are made by Thales. They've been trying to substitute over time their own derivations using Chinese chipsets and are starting to produce ones without Thales avionics, but there was no big Russian base of high-end cockpit avionics, let alone some of the more sensitive stuff that you need in terms of high-end processing capability and the architectures you need to fuse data from multiple different sensors without either cancelling out real tracks or creating multiples of single tracks, because each sensor will be seeing things in a slightly different way. And so the same thing will potentially risk appearing in multiples. And also in trying to avoid multiples, you risk essentially cancelling out a real track. That's one of the things that took so long to get right with the F-35. It's not on a single aircraft. The F-35 shares that across a 4-ship. So they will automatically, across a link called MADL, Multifunction Advanced Data Link, they will share their, not just the sensors on each jet interfacing with each other, the infrared, electro-optical, radar sensors, passive sensors, are all combining into an analyzed cross-referenced picture on each jet, but they're also doing it with the same sensors across 4 jets in a formation, which therefore will be in a spread, will give you what's called a multi-static picture, a multiple perspective picture on target. That took basically a decade to make work for the US, with all of the microelectronics expertise that the US has access to, with 3 generations of stealth combat aircraft but under their belt, and with $500 billion to put into the program, because it's really hard. And so I'm not sure I buy that the Russians have managed to take even just 4 different radar pictures from the 4 different radar sets on the Su-57 plus the L-band receivers in the leading edge, and combine them into a really solid single picture that doesn't have issues. So yeah, I don't think it's comparable at this stage, but it's very lethal for anything that isn't 5th generation.
Talking about the Russians, I want to use this maybe to make a little segue, because I could talk about this a lot longer, but there's another big topic that I wanted to talk about, and that's the air power in context of the war in Ukraine and what it actually looks like, the deployment of F-16s, drones, how Ukraine changed how our air power works, and there's a lot of things I want to talk about. But maybe first I wanted to take a step back on this topic and talk about something that you said regarding to the war, because you said in the summer of this year that, to quote you, we're currently on a pathway toward Ukraine losing, and that Ukraine's possible defeat could come within the next 2 years. So several months forward to today, do you still think, before we get to the other topics related to Ukraine, do you still think that's the case? And if that's true, what makes you think that? And do you think that the situation got worse or better since July, when you made that original remark?
Thank you for listening to this episode. If you want to help me make more of these interviews, which take a surprising amount of time and effort, and hear the second part, you can become a supporter on Patreon. There's almost an hour left of this conversation in the second part, where we talk about Ukraine, about why the F-16s didn't have as much impact as people have hoped. What does air war in Ukraine look like today, and how did it change since the beginning of the war? Or why isn't Ukraine using Gripen and other types of fighter jets, even though it probably could? But whether you decide to become a supporter or not, thank you for being here. I really appreciate it. And I'll see you next time.